Welcome to Unreal Gems. In this video we are going to continue with the creation of Citrin's physics asset. As you can see, I haven't chosen an epic character because I wanted you to see the difficulties that arise when you don't have a character specifically created for this task. So let's get to it. Okay, so the next step is going to be creating the base spine 01 because we need to create a rigid body for the spine. Let's go ahead and, as always, rotate it and place it where we need to. This is going to be the same process as always, so let's go ahead and speed it up a little bit. We have to look at it from multiple angles. Okay, so I'm not an artist, I'm a programmer, so I'm doing my best, but bear with me. It looks okay, so let's not waste any more time than we need. Let's do some more fine-tuning. It is now looking good. I think it is enough. So right now you can see that there is no constraint. So with right click you can go ahead and create the constraint with the pelvis. And with that we have our constraint and our rigid body. We can now place it properly, because if not it is going to do weird things. Lock it with 1, 2, 3. And right now we are ready to, as always, unlock it one by one and rotate it properly so it fits our character. Let's go ahead and, as I mentioned before, rotate it. It is now looking good. Let's lock it again. And this time we have twist motion. So we are going to deal with that first. This motion is different. It's the third degree of freedom that we have available. As soon as we set it, you're going to see how it twists. That's why it's called twist motion. As you can see, the spine is looking good, maybe too much dynamic range. So let's go ahead and turn down the angle. Let's go for 40. And now let's deal with the other degree of freedom. So in this case, again, we are going to lock the twist motion and unlock the swing to motion. And let's adjust the back and forth in the spine. So as you can see, we can use Alt and let it move more to one side than the other, so that it moves forward more than backward. Let's simulate. Okay, you can see that it moves forward perfectly and backward less, which is what we want. If you are having problems, you need to pay attention to the limits and the red line, because as you can see with this debugging mode, we can see when it is hitting those limits, which will allow us to debug the problems that can arise with the limits. So as you can see, it looks good. We can activate the constraints to see the limits and everything when we are simulating. This is really good for debugging. So as you can see, you can go to character and then constraint drawing, and you can go to all limits. That is really useful. You can turn it back off when you don't need it and back on when you need it. So I recommend turning this on when you are creating the rigid bodies, because it is really useful for dealing with constraints. So the next thing that we are going to try is those two movements together, so we can see how everything is performing in tandem. And let's go ahead and activate the twist motion limits. And right now let's simulate again and see what the spine does. And we can tell that, well, if we go too far, it's doing some weird things, but for a normal case, it is not going to twist as much. Maybe we could decrease a little the degrees of freedom, but right now I think it's looking great, and we can go ahead and look for the next rigid body. So the same as always, add replace bodies to spine 02, and we are going to do the same process as before, but this time with the next rigid body. Okay, so it looks good now. So let's go ahead and deal with the constraint as always. So it is free. Let's go ahead and lock it. 1, 2, 3 to lock it. And right now when it is locked, let's go ahead and one by one, we are going to add the swing motions. So let's start rotating the constraint because it was not facing the proper way. Remember, down the length of the bone. So in this case, up. And once we have it properly set, we can go ahead and start adjusting the limits and the movement. Remember that I'm using 1, 2, 3 to adjust the limits without having to go to the interface. And right now I'm activating the first one and simulating so we can see what it does. It's looking more or less okay, but maybe a little too much angular movement. So let's go to the constraint and down to the angular limits, and let's turn down the swing 1 limit, which is the constraint that we are using right now. Next, we are going to deal with the swing 2 motion, and let's go ahead and adjust it. We are going to select the constraint and we are going to rotate it. So we are trying to have different amount of movement back and forth. Let's go ahead and turn it a little down because it was way too much. We don't have that range of motion in that part of the spine. So let's simulate and see. We did it the wrong way. So as you can see here, we can debug the limits. You can see that we are hitting the limit before forward than backward. We wanted the opposite. I just did this so you could see how to debug a problem. And again, let's not select the rigid body when we are rotating. Let's select the constraint and let's turn it with Alt to the other side. So the back part hits first and we can move forwards a lot more than backwards. So let's simulate now and let's see what happens with the constraint. As you can see, when we click, we can go forward more than we can go backward. So everything is looking more or less good and I am satisfied with this result. And bear in mind that this may look too constrained, but this movement is going to be linked to the movement of the spine 1. So if we simulate, you can see that there are a lot more degrees of freedom than it may look. So you can see that we can move a lot back and forth, a lot more than we could with the spine 2. So just bear in mind that everything compounds, so don't go too overboard with each constraint. So we can go ahead and turn on the other limit and see everything moving together. So it looks good. It looks more or less real. Maybe we could offset the constraint position, but since this video is already running long, I don't want it to be eternal. So let's go ahead and keep on going. So right now we are going to deal with the next constraint that is going to be the head. So we need to look for the bone, and when we find it, we will do the same thing as always. So right click, add replace bodies. This time the size is more or less correct, but as always we are going to fine tune it. It is looking good, but maybe a little part of the neck is sticking out, so let's fix that. Okay, so now it is looking correct. As always, the constraint will not work, but as always, again, we are going to fix it. In terms of the jewel that holds the hair, we'll deal with it in the physics asset of the hair. Okay, so right now it looks good and we can go ahead and start dialing in the constraint. So lock everything with 1, 2, 3 as always, hitting it a couple of times, and when you are ready we can start one by one, same as always, and rotating the constraint so it faces the correct way. Let's go ahead and do that. It is looking good. Don't hold Alt for this. Only hold Alt when I tell you to. And right now, let's start adjusting the limits because they were too much. So let's go ahead and use 35 degrees. And let's open up the second degree of freedom, the swing to motion. And this time we are going to want a little less also. And now we need to place properly the constraint, because right now if we simulate, you're going to see that we move way too much forward and not as much backward. So we need to fix that with Alt and rotating as always. So let's go ahead and do that. And right now we can do it with selecting the constraint and holding Alt and rotating. You can see that right now the starting position of the constraint is being altered, and we can now simulate, and you're going to see that we move less forward, more backward, and that's more or less what we want. So the constraint is looking good. Once we are satisfied, we can go ahead and select the constraint, turn on both limits, and simulate so we can see how it is looking when both limits are active. You can see that the head is turning properly and everything is looking good. So we are satisfied with this and we can go ahead and finish up. Okay, let's go ahead and simulate with Alt-I everything. You can see that some rigid bodies are not simulating. That can be due to not having them in simulated and having them in kinematic. Select everything. You can do it with Ctrl-A or right-click and select all bodies. And with all bodies selected, you can go to the physics type, which is up, and select simulated. With that, when you press Alt-I, everything should be simulating. You can drag with Ctrl right-click and everything is looking good except the arms because they don't have a physics asset, so that is normal. We will deal with that next. And as you can see, everything is looking good when we start simulating because nothing is exploding, nothing is moving when there is no gravity, which is correct. And just remember, if it is not working, make sure that you don't have in the physics type kinematic, because the rigid bodies are going to stick to the bones and not simulate. Okay, so the next bone and the next rigid body that we are going to create is the clavicle. So we are looking for it, and as soon as we find it, we will right click and again add replace bodies. You're going to see that it is placed in the wrong place. So we need to move it as always and resize it. It looks good now, the rigid body, but the constraint, as you can see, is in the wrong place also. So let's lock it 1, 2, 3 and place it properly, which is going to be between the spine rigid body and the clavicle rigid body. It is looking better now. And as soon as we are done, I think it is okay, we can go ahead and configure the limits. Right now we have too many rigid bodies, so we are going to display only the selected rigid bodies, which will make it easier for us to see what we are doing. So let's select the clavicle, and now we can see perfectly where it is placed. Since we are not seeing the constraint right now, let's adjust the settings of the skeleton tree, and we can now see the constraints and select them, and we will now adjust the rotation of the constraint because it was facing the wrong way. So now it is better, but still we need to dial in the limits. I'm pressing 1 and 2, remember. Right now it is looking okay, but we need to see the other rigid bodies to test. So let's go ahead and go back to rendering all of them. And with all of them present, let's go ahead and simulate selected. So we can see, pressing again Control right click, how it is moving. Okay, so there we go. We have movement on the arm. It is not perfect, but we will dial it in a little bit next. So let's go ahead and do that. Select the constraint, and we are going to play with the limits. We need it to move more up and down than back and forth. So let's go ahead and see the limits, which one is which. And let's switch to 40 on the swing 1 limit and a little less on the swing 2 limit, so 30. And let's now simulate and see what's going on and see if it is working better. As you can see, with the cone, you can tell the dynamic range that the clavicle has. Let's go ahead and simulate. It is looking better. It is not clipping as much, and maybe still not enough up and down, but let's go ahead and Alt rotate to allow it to move further up so it doesn't clip as much with the body, and it allows it to move further up like a normal body would. We can now simulate and see how the arm is doing. We can push it up a little further and down. It does not clip as bad, so I think it is looking better. Since we don't want to make this video huge, let's go ahead and look for the next bone, for the next rigid body. We are going to do the bicep, so let's look for the upper arm bone and add replace bodies. As always, the body is added in the wrong place due to the skeleton not being properly sized, and so on and so forth. We have the constraint also in the wrong place, so let's go ahead and modify everything. The bicep is going to be way easier because it is one of the bones that can be locked. So let's go ahead and resize it. First, the rigid body, and then deal with the constraint. Right now, it is quite difficult to see it, so I'm going to render only the selected rigid body and resize it as always. Okay, so it is now looking good, and let's go ahead and deal with the constraint. As always, let's lock everything up, 1, 2, and 3. And now we can go ahead and see where it is placed and where it needs to be. As I mentioned before, this one is quite easy because it is locked, because the bicep is locked to the clavicle. So in this case, everything is looking good. Let's see all of the bodies again so we can simulate and see how everything is looking. By the way, I'm trying to simulate from the bicep. This makes no sense because it is locked to the clavicle. So it is only going to try to move, but it is not really going to be able to. So let's go ahead and select the clavicle, which is free, and let's now move the bicep, and we can see perfectly how everything is moving together, and it is looking really nice. The bind skin is not perfect because it is the actor core bind skin. I haven't fine-tuned it, so it could be better, but the physics simulation, it's working perfectly. So let's now go ahead and deal with the next rigid body, which is going to be the forearm. So let's go ahead and look for the bone, right click, add replace bodies, and let's go ahead and do the same things as always. That is only the selected solid, and let's go ahead and resize it and make it fit the lower arm. Okay, so let's look at it from multiple sides and let's dial it in. Okay, it is looking really good right now. I'm warning you that working with this constraint is going to be difficult. Let's go ahead and unselect and let's adjust the constraint. It is going to give us trouble because of the orientation. Let's look it up and let's see what I mean. So let's go ahead and use one of the swing motions to adjust the orientation, and when I use it, you are going to see what's the problem. Okay, let's adjust a little more the forearm, just enough to be exactly in the middle of the arm. And let's go ahead now and deal with the constraint. So as I mentioned before, the orientation in this constraint is not great. As you can see, it is not facing the proper way and it is going to be difficult to adjust. We are looking for it to be perpendicular to the side of the arm. So as you can see, there is not a straightforward rotation that will allow us to properly move the arm. So we just have to deal with 3D rotations and trying to get it perpendicular, but as you can see, it is not easy. So I'm just gonna fast forward over this. Okay, so we are more or less there, but still some rotations left. It is looking better, but still not there. Okay, more or less we are almost there. As you can see, doing it properly in Maya helps a lot. Okay, so there we are. This can be it. So let's go ahead and deal with the limits now. As we can see, the arm can have more range of motion, so we are going to try a higher limit. This is going to be probably too much, so let's go ahead and go back down to 80, and even then it may be too much, so let's see. Let's simulate first and decide later. Okay, so control right click to move it. Okay, so the arm is moving way too far back, so we are gonna have to fix that because right now the movement is not looking natural at all. So you can see there the limits working, and we can see that the limit down is what is causing the problem. So we need to probably lower the limits, and then we need to rotate the starting limit. So okay, let's go ahead and turn it down 45, and let's now rotate it with Alt to alter the starting position of the simulation. Since these rotations are really weird, you are going to see that they cause problems. But I wanted you to see that because it can come up when you are creating the rigid bodies. And okay, let's not select the rigid body. Let's select the constraint and now Alt and rotate. So we have it closer to the bicep than the forearm. But take a look now, because when we simulate, it is going to move on its own. Remember that I told you that this was a sign of problems. So you need to check what is happening right now. I'm going to tell you that it is probably related to the starting position not being between the limits. So as you can see now, the red line is between the limits, but it is not on the plane of the limits. So what the system is trying to do is reach the plane with that red line from the beginning. So that is what's causing the problem. So we need to rotate the plane so it starts parallel to the line. So just remember that, because that is what I'm going to try to do now. So let's go ahead and turn it back down so they are coplanar. Okay, so let's take a look now. Let's fine tune it a little more and let's see if that is the cause of the problem. Let's go ahead and simulate now. Okay, so you can see here that the amount of movement from the beginning it's minimal. So that means that we have fixed it. And right now it's looking better. It is not going so far back. So I think this can be enough for now, because we don't want to take forever and we are already running the 20-minute mark. So let's go to the hand and create again the rigid body. Let's go ahead and resize it as always. And when we are satisfied, let's look at it from different angles. And you know what's coming. Let's deal with the constraint. Lock it with 1, 2, 3. And when we are locked, right now we have to deal with the rotation because of the wrong bone orientation in Maya. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with that motion. Yeah, it looks good. Let's rotate it. Okay, it is looking fine now. We can work with this. So let's go ahead and try to simulate first, just to double check that it is right first. Okay, it is looking fine. Let's turn down the angle because it's too much, I think. So let's go down to 25 and let's simulate again just to check. Let's do a simulate selected. And with that, let's see. It is looking good, I think. Yeah, perfect. So let's now go to the other motion. Select the constraint and let's deal with the up-down motion. So let's go ahead and go from the side. We can see better. It is looking like it could be already close to what we need. So let's go ahead and simulate with these limits. Let's see. Yeah, it's looking right. So we are lucky. It looks like it is working. Let's activate both limits at the same time. It is looking good, but still we need to simulate just in case. Let's go ahead and simulate selected and now move with control right click. The hand is looking good. So more or less we are done. Since the video is already long, let's just now check the whole arm and see if it's working. And if it is, we are satisfied. Let's say goodbye. Bye-bye. Okay, it is looking fine. I think for a normal ragdoll, it should be more than enough. And as you can see, it is looking pretty fine. If I had more time, I would probably dial it in a little more, but for this video, I think it is enough. Well, so that's it for this video. Bear with me, we are almost there. There is only one video left in which we will learn how to mirror and create collisions, and that will be it. So remember, if this video has been useful, go ahead, like and subscribe, and we'll see each other in the next videos. Huge shout out and thanks to all my Patreons. As you know, making these videos takes a ton of time and effort because I research in depth all of the topics that I cover. So if you want me to keep making awesome stuff, consider supporting me on Patreon.